Welcome to the Divorce Survival Guide podcast, where we have open and honest conversations about co-parenting, separation, divorce, and the hardest question of all, should you stay or should you go? I'm Kate Anthony, your divorce survival guide, and I'm here to help you navigate some of the roughest waters you've ever swum in and answer some of your toughest questions. I've been to hell and back, and now it's my mission in life to help you get to the other side of this process with your sanity and your heart intact.
Hey everyone, welcome back. So today I have someone on the podcast that I was really excited about. Grant Wyeth is a Melbourne and occasionally Sweden-based writer. He is currently a columnist for the Asia Pacific Affairs publication, The Diplomat. He's an editor at Asia Pacific Development, Diplomacy, and Defense Dialogue, and he writes the Substack newsletter, International Blue. So Grant's work primarily focuses on the issues of foreign affairs, writing for these incredibly esteemed publications. But over the last few years, he has taken a serious interest in the behavior of family courts. And he's written extensively on these issues. And he's also spoken at a number of public forums on it. And so he wrote this incredible Substack. And I wrote to him and said, can you please be on my podcast? He had written about parental alienation and the family court system. And I just wrote to him, total cold call. And I was like, hi, I very much need you to be on my podcast. And from vacation in Sweden, he took an hour out of his time. And he came onto the podcast. He was just incredibly generous with his time. And I'm so grateful to bring you this conversation with Grant Wyeth. Grant, thank you so much for being here. I am so incredibly grateful that you took the time.
Thank you for reaching out and inviting me to be on the show.
Yeah. So first of all, let's start with this is not your area of expertise normally. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be sort of studying this issue so in depth.
Yeah. So my professional background is in international relations or foreign affairs. So I write for a publication called The Diplomat, which is an Asia Pacific Affairs publication. I work for an organization at the moment which has a terrible mouthful of a name called Asia Pacific Development, Diplomacy, and Defense Dialogue.
Oh dear. Oh dear.
AP4D for short. And so
that's much better. Yeah. That's much better branding.
Much better branding, yeah. So, and we write reports on kind of Australia's foreign policy, especially in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Mm. So this is my professional background. It's in foreign affairs, but I've come to this issue, I guess in a personal way, because my partner. So I'm currently here in Sweden with my partner. My partner actually works for an organization. She has a organization in Iceland where she's lived most of her adult life that helps women and children navigate family court systems.
Oh, wonderful.
So she's converted me, basically. She's been the one that says, you need to look at this and you need to find a way of understanding this and see whether you can use your skills as a writer to kind of explain this. So the impetus comes from her. So that's my background. And so I guess for the last few years, maybe 3 years, I've been studying this phenomenon of how family court systems have become so, I guess we can say, corrupted, and why they are producing the outcomes that are, I guess, the opposite of what we would expect them to produce. So I think most people who don't have an understanding of or haven't had contact with family court systems, they would assume that abuse is treated as abuse, like physical abuse, sexual abuse is treated as abuse, but this is not the case at all. And it's nuts.
I love, you do say in your article that you wrote about this, you do say that like any normal person sort of reading about this would think this was absolutely absurd. Like, right? And like it makes no sense.
It makes no sense. And I think the system hides behind the absurdity. That's like it's an incredible smokescreen for them because the general public wouldn't believe it if you told it to them. And so that allows these court systems to get away with their behavior.
Yeah. It's incredible how many people sort of, when they're, and this is sort of the double abuse of it, right? The re-traumatization is that when you tell anyone outside of the system what the system is doing to you, their response is often like, well, I mean, do you have a lawyer? Or like, well, wait a minute, like that doesn't make any sense. Like, surely they would. And then you have to go into this explanation that's too exhausting and re-traumatizing because none of that does make sense.
Yeah. And also the other common reaction that I've found is that, oh, well, there must be more to the story. There must be more to the story. And usually it's the mother or the woman, there must be something suspicious about her.
She's got to be crazy. Right. Yeah, exactly. She must be crazy. She must have done something abusive. There's got to be some reason for this because the explanation that it's the system doesn't make sense.
Yeah. It doesn't make sense. Yeah.
So recently, there's been kind of a somewhat large development where the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights issued a global call, as you said, I'm quoting from your article, a global call for input into child custody cases and violence against women and children. This is kind of a big deal.
It's a big deal, and the report that was created out of this input was just released a few weeks ago.
Right, exactly.
And so that's I guess an incredibly positive initiative, but it's all, I guess, the UN doesn't have the ability to force these things. It's more just about bringing attention to them. That the hope is that now countries start to pay attention to what the UN is saying. Now that's kind of where we're at.
It's sort of interesting. It's almost like, as you say that, what I see is almost like Caden's Law in the Violence Against Women's Act. Well, okay, we put it in VAWA, but it doesn't mean anything until each individual state enacts a law that prevents this.
Yeah,
right?
So it's Caden's Law, I guess, is more, it's positive. It's very positive, but it's more encouraging the states in the United States to actually, understand what's going on, and then it's up to them. Unfortunately, I mean, this is Australia, is also a federal system, so it's up to states whether they enact these reforms. Although I should say, the family court is a federal court, so it's not individual states. But in general, Australia works in a way to the United States, the federal system.
So I was just it just seems like the UN report feels like the macro version of like these smaller, right? Like we still have, so even then, right, it's like, okay, the UN may say this is an issue we need to deal with. The Violence Against Women's Act says this is something that the states have to deal with. Then the states will enact the laws, but still the family courts actually have to comply, right? You start with this umbrella and then we have to get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller.
Yeah. And also, as we've seen, I guess, as I've seen over the last few years, the family courts are very good at working their way around legislation as well. They have an idea about what they want to produce, and they'll interpret an idea like the best interest of the child in the way that they want to interpret it, not in the way that, I guess, common sense would interpret the best interest of the child.
Right. Yep. Let me sort of go back a little bit. So how do you see this? Like, why does this matter on a global scale?
Well, on a global scale, because it's such a common thing in any country you look at now at the moment. It's, so even something, Iceland always comes up top of the best place in the world to be a woman, but this still happens. You still have these justice systems that are incredibly hostile to women and children in Iceland. But so in my home country of Australia, in the United States, obviously, Canada, the UK, France. It's happening all around. So it is a global phenomenon, and it's a phenomenon of, I guess, what we can call institutional capture. It's a global institutional capture by, what makes it really extraordinary is a concept that has no professional credibility. This is parental alienation, but has managed to work its way into these systems and become the dominant lens of how these systems operate.
Right. One of the things that you say, you sort of say in this, it's a political and international of political and international importance for two reasons, right? And the first one I love, right? How societies treat women and children is a true reflection of their social health.
Yeah.
We're fucked.
Yeah.
I mean, in a word, right? Like, oh God.
I mean, that's I remember that's a comment Michelle Obama made a few years ago as well, and I think it's incredibly true. I mean, this reflects the social health, and if you look, especially if you're looking, I guess, from my background in developing countries and whatnot, you can tie what you could call, I guess, human flourishing to countries that treat women and children with respect and dignity, and countries that don't. Obviously, if we look at somewhere like Afghanistan at the moment, that has an absolute hostility to women, they're also an incredibly poor and backwards country.
Right. Yes.
And the two things are correlated.
They are.
Yeah.
They are. And then, the second one that you say, which I think is really also wonderful, is that one of the central pillars of our current political instability is men's inability to emotionally cope with the advancement of women. Hello.
Yeah.
Can you sort of say more about that and why?
Well, I think in the last few decades, we've seen this real acceleration of female education globally. And we've seen, once women are free to be able to gain degrees and make economic choices and make career choices for themselves, they're very much just accelerating past men. And men are finding it incredibly emotionally difficult to deal with this, I think. And so if you look at a lot of your authoritarian movements, a lot of your populist movements, they're driven a lot by this male resentment. And something something that was pointed out in the United States with a lot of the activity around January 6th, a lot of the people who were involved in January 6th had I wouldn't say convictions, but had histories of domestic violence.
Domestic violence. Yep.
There's a connection there between like household instability and political instability. That's the connection, and they work in tandem with each other.
And almost all mass shooters have a history of domestic violence. I mean, it is so correlated. Okay, so let's we sort of touched on parental alienation. So let's jump to Gardner. Explain the history of this, because I think a lot of people don't quite understand. I will say that I was one of them. It took me a couple of years. I'm like, well, but it is alienation. Like if the other parent is turning the child against them, like they are alienating them. And it took a long time for me to recognize, like, oh, no, that's just another form of domestic violence, right? That's not alienation. That's violence. And so let's start with Gardner and how this sort of began, and then how it was able to weave itself into the family law system.
Yes. So in the early 1980s, Richard Gardner, who was a child psychiatrist, he often gets credited as being affiliated to Columbia University but he was only a volunteer there. He wasn't a member of staff there. So he doesn't have
I don't think I knew that.
Yeah, he doesn't have the professional credibility that he's often labeled with. So he invented this concept called parental alienation syndrome, which was basically, he felt that men were being unfairly accused of child sexual abuse, and he wanted to find a way of making sure that men didn't suffer any consequences for child sexual abuse. So he created this idea of parental alienation syndrome that said when mothers accuse fathers of child sexual abuse, what they're really doing is brainwashing their children to hate their fathers. And that's what's actually going on. And this, like, in terms of the scientific background of the way he laid out his arguments and whatnot, it had no professional credibility. You know, the American Association of Psychologists has never accepted this, but it gained legal credibility because it became this tool that men could use inside family courts. And so the economic incentives in family courts are always designed to find a way. The demand in family courts is men not wishing to face consequences for their behavior, whether that's violence, whether that's domestic violence. So servicing that demand has become the economic framework of family courts. So parental alienation syndrome and then parental alienation was able to latch on to that economic incentive, and really just be able to work its way through the courts. And we see this with lawyers who specialize now in parental alienation, therapists who specialize in parental alienation, your reunification camps, which are actually a form of brainwashing, but pretend to be deprogramming children.
Oh, and the abuse. I mean, the abuse with the reunification camps. If anyone is interested in learning a little bit more about how that functions, if you following the story of Maya and Sebastian out of Santa Cruz, and Maya, God love her, was smart enough to have people on standby as she was ripped from her father. In this case, her mother is the abuser. Ripped from her father's home, literally screaming, and was violently abused by the extraction team that came to get her and her brother. I mean, it's a horrible story.
So I should say just a caveat there. I've been talking, I guess, this about men. I would say most cases this is abusive males, but there are cases of abusive mothers as well.
Yes. The statistics are that it's mostly men, but it is not always. We know that, right? And one of the things about Gardner that I think is worth noting, he not only was discrediting children's claims of sexual abuse, but he also said that it was somehow natural, right? That it's not really abuse because it's sort of child. I mean, it's so absurd, right? That it's somehow natural.
Yeah, he said that there was he was trying to claim that there was a species survival mechanism here, that that in order for the species to survive, men need to find ways of procreating, and if that's with children, then it's with children. I mean, that was his argument. And
not only that, but that the children were actually seducing the fathers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Really extraordinary stuff. And quite sick, really. But unfortunately, and for a man with such views to gain such a foothold in family court systems is really obscene, I think.
Absolutely. And it just continues. I mean, this started in the 80s, right? And we are still dealing with the consequences of it. And, you say that the genius of all of this is that the more the mother or a child accuses or insists that the abuse is happening, the more evidence of alienation, right? Yeah. So it's like, what is it? The Chinese finger thing where the more you pull and the more you strain against it, the tighter the grip, right?
Yeah. That creates this system in family courts where love is punished. The more you try to demonstrate your love to your child, the more suspicion the court has of you. So it's a trap. It's completely a trap.
Absolutely. And it's classic Darvo, right? we're gonna we're gonna deny attack. I'm not the the problem. You're the problem. And in fact, I'm the victim, right? And this is where fathers' rights groups get their foothold. Like, oh no, we're all being victimized by being accused of these things.
Yeah, and I think, trying to understand the psychology of this victimhood mentality is that a lot of these men believe that they have this natural right, a natural right to dominate their families and a natural right to violence in a lot of stages, a lot of cases, I should say, and that especially that violence is an essential component of masculinity. And if you are trying to prevent male violence, well, you're actually persecuting men because violence is essential to what men are.
Yes.
This is and it's so when you come across this and it's such a, unfortunately it's prevalent in the culture where you have people like Andrew Tate who've become these huge online celebrities, and teenage boys are really aligning themselves with Andrew Tate. This idea of male dominance and male violence is incredibly mainstream. This idea that men have the right to dominate,
that men have the right to dominate in this way, and that anyone who accuses them or says that it's bad, right, is a liar, or doesn't understand men, or we're somehow oppressing them.
Or they're jealous. Oh, we're just jealous.
Oh, yeah. They're just jealous of our power. Mm-hmm. You also say that, parental alienation is built around two core tenets, one of which is that women are liars.
Yeah,
right.
Just default setting, women are liars. Yeah.
Women are liars. And then the second being that contact with a father is more important than protection from abuse.
Yeah. Yeah. And so once a court digests that idea and has that idea that contact is the most important thing, there's really nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do to convince a court that your child is actually in danger, because the court thinks, well, even if he is violent and abusive, it's still more detrimental to a child to not have contact with him. And we've seen, especially in the US, we've seen this leads to the murder of children. It's leading to the murder.
Right. Yeah. Let's talk about that, because we touched on Caden's Law. So if you want to take that and talk about what Caden's Law is and what it's based on.
So yeah, Caden's Law was developed out of the murder of one of these children. Yeah, and it was designed to kind of, I guess, give judges, more training and more understanding of the mechanics of domestic violence and the mechanics of child abuse, because I think a lot of these family court judges just don't have the background in these issues, and they don't really understand the dynamics, the mechanics and the dynamics of household abuse.
They are not required to have any training in domestic violence. They are consistently making rulings about it. They're hearing it, but they have zero training in recognizing any of the signs of it, which is horrifying. Yeah. I mean, it's absolutely horrifying.
It's absolutely horrifying. And I think there's still as well judges who hold these kind of, outdated ideas about, well, the man is the head of the household and, he, what he says goes. And so if you're resisting that, then you're the problem,
Yeah, that's right. Caden was a little girl who was 7 or 8 years old, right? Who was she was 7, and she was murdered by her biological father after her mother had been begging the courts not to have contact, but like, please don't send my daughter into this violent man's home. And I think from what I understand, the the theory was like, well, he just abused you. He doesn't have a history of abusing Caden. So like, right. Not, and again, this absolutely points to the fact that judges don't understand how domestic violence works. If you can no longer control me directly, and you can no longer directly abuse me, you're going to do the next thing that's closest to me.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
And what is the worst thing you can do to a mother?
Yeah. Hurt her child.
And so she did. Yeah.
The other component of that is that, as you mentioned, that judges only see the problem as being between the two partners or two former partners. Mm-hmm. And they don't really understand that even if a child isn't hit itself, being witness to domestic abuse is a form of domestic abuse.
That's right. It's child abuse. It is child abuse to witness domestic violence.
Yeah. And because, the psychological damage this does to children, the sense of living in a household of fear constantly, this, it hampers their development. It leaves these permanent scars. I don't think judges quite understand that yet. They just think, oh, well, the two partners are broken up now, so the problem's solved. But that's not the case at all.
And so often I see this too, is that, this label high conflict. Oh, this is a high conflict case. If only one person is being high conflict and the other person is being protective, that's not a high conflict case. That is a domestic abuse case.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. The term high conflict implies that both parties are to blame.
Right. And then they send them into like mediation, right? Yeah. They're sort of forced mediation where a victim is forced to sit down and try to negotiate terms with somebody for whom negotiation is another tactic of abuse, and with someone who is actually drawn to conflict right. The victim is saying, please, let's just end this. Let's end this. Mm-hmm. While the abuser is perpetuating it and reveling in it.
That's something that came out of the UN report as well, is for courts to understand that they're being used as a weapon, or courts or mediation or social services or reunification camps. All these institutions are being used as a weapon. And it's what abusers, it's the perspective of abusers is that, I'm going to use the institutions that are meant to protect you against you. Mm-hmm. It's a way of capturing these institutions and using them, right. And especially a lot of financial abuse that goes on as well. Like if you can constantly drag your partner into the courts and that they can't afford to be in the courts, that's another weapon that you have.
And now for a quick word from our sponsor. The all-new, fully revised Should I Stay or Should I Go? After 3 years of this program existing in the world and changing women's lives, I decided to give it a full makeover. The all-new version has all new videos, a podcast-like audio stream if you want to take the work on the go, and completely updated resources for deepening your learning. The program consists of 6 core modules. The first of which is Who Are You? This is the section in which you dig deeply into your own personal development and get in touch with your inner guide, slay your inner critics, mine for values, and learn how to set healthy boundaries. The second module is How You Learn to Love and helps you understand your attachment style, love languages, and how to properly love and care for the most important person in all of this, yourself. Module 3 is called Why Are Women So Exhausted? And breaks down some of the issues around toxic masculinity and male entitlement, the myth of being a stay-at-home mom, and answers the question, he's fine. Why can't I just be happy? Module 4 is all about understanding abuse and includes videos on trauma bonds, understanding the cycles of abuse, particularly how they play out in your own relationship, and addresses addiction, infidelity, and mental illness. Module 5 is all about healing and moving forward and includes videos about therapy, couples therapy, healing from betrayal, emotional regulation, and grief. This section also includes my 90-minute workshop, Tackling Codependence, as well as my signature relationship inventory that will help you gain complete clarity on all the parts of your marriage and figure out what's his and what's yours. And Module 6 answers the question, is the grass really greener on the other side? With in-depth videos on dating, cultural and religious isolation, and what happens if you end up alone forever. Spoiler, you probably won't. Whether you decide to stay or go, this program will set you up for a lifetime of clarity and fulfillment. And if you've already decided to go, the program will help you unpack all that's happened and help you heal so that you can move forward without repeating the same mistakes that got you here in the first place. This program is priced super low at just $697. And if you use the code PODCAST, when you check out, you'll get $50 off the full price. What are you waiting for? You have been agonizing with this decision for long enough. It's time to finally know. Should you stay or should you go? And now back to our episode.
All of this I want to point out, right, is really bringing to mind the Johnny Depp Amber Heard case, right, where you had one person who was, perpetuating the legal systems and the filings and really reveling in the drama of it all. And then you have Amber Heard, who was just, head down, trying to get through it, trying to live her life, and it was such, to me, a horrifying moment when even, feminists, even people that nobody could wrap their brains around the fact that Johnny Depp was an abuser, despite all the evidence, right?
Yeah. I was going to say, and that was also, it was designed to humiliate her. It was about publicly and globally humiliating her. And I guess we can make an extension from that and to send a shot over the bow to all women, as to say, if you speak up, this is what happens to you.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. If you speak up, this is what happens to you. And also, look how nobody believes you. Everybody hates you because you're not perfect.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And especially these incredibly powerful men who have, like Johnny Depp, who have these huge audiences, and and obviously you may have grown up and you've watched his movies and whatnot, and so you have an emotional attachment to him, and so he has this enormous power over large swathes of the population. So he can do this, and he can get them to believe him over all the evidence.
That's right. That's right. Over all the evidence. I mean, astonishing, and I grew up with Johnny Depp. I mean, I'm of the generation where I grew up on 21 Jump Street. I was a teenager and he was posters of him on my wall as a teen. It was very hard for me to reconcile this. But being a victim's advocate and being a domestic violence expert and advocate in all that I do, I was like, holy shit, right? You can see it.
Yeah.
One of the things that it's not back to the, contact with the father at all costs, right? It's more important than protecting from abuse. Not only is that the most important thing, but it's also women's job and the mother's job, right? To facilitate that contact, right? Yeah. Men they're not out here. Abusive men are not out there fostering their own relationships with their children, right? But then if they don't have a relationship with their children, it's our fault, and we must facilitate that.
Yeah, and this expectation of women, it places women in this incredibly difficult position, because every cell in a mother's body is to protect her child. And if there's a danger that she knows is a known danger, and you're being told that no, your job is to actually facilitate the relationship with this known danger, it's the mental stress of that is beyond just the child abuse, but the mental stress on the mother is extraordinary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the more you protect, the more likely you are to actually lose custody, as was proven with, I don't even know, is it Meyer or Meyer? I don't know. I've heard both. Joan Meyer of George Washington University Law School, in her study, right, that found that, it found many things, many horrifying statistics, but can you explain what came out of that study?
The actual statistics on hand, but the statistics were quite extraordinary in terms of breaking down in terms of when a mother brings evidence of domestic abuse, and what are the rates of a mother losing custody. And it found that, especially with child sexual abuse, this was more likely for mothers to lose custody with child sex abuse. There's something within these legal systems that just don't want to know about child sexual abuse, that they can't get their brains around it.
Right. And that when fathers are accused of child abuse, and then a counterclaim of parental alienation is made, it doubles the mother's likelihood of losing custody.
Yeah, that was the main statistic. I'm just bringing them up again now. Sorry.
I know I was about to do that too. You've got them. You got them. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's extraordinary. It's because it goes. I think goes back to what we were saying at the start, that if the general public were aware of this, and there's so many mothers that I've been in contact with over the last few years who are working tirelessly to bring this out into the public, so the general public are aware of this. But if it was known, if there were, if it was on the front page of papers, as it should be, I don't think that these courts would be able to get away with this. They operate in a certain secrecy that allows them to produce these results.
Yep. One of the things I just wanted to, and that's what Kayden's law really seeks to do. And again, Kayden's law is simply was put into the Violence Against Women's Act, which doesn't make it the law of the land. All it does is it provides financial incentives for each state to enact the laws in their state. But it doesn't actually create a law. But there are 4 points that Kayden's law provides that, if each state were to take it up, would be the law of those states, right? So do you have those on hand? What those 4? I have them, but
got a little Kayden's law briefer here. I'll pull it up. So the 4 points are: the first, restricting expert testimony to only those who are appropriately qualified to provide it. So this is a big problem in family courts at the moment, where these parental alienation experts, as they call themselves, who have no professional credibility or no professional degrees or whatnot, but they are able to come into courts and give evidence. So trying to stem the flow of these people within courts, that's the first point. Limiting the use of reunification camps and therapies, as we've talked before. These are really brainwashing institutions that take.
Yeah, let's. I want to what is a reunification camp? Can you talk about that briefly?
When a court decides that a child is exhibiting the symptoms of parental alienation, courts will say, well, we'll send you to a reunification camp, so you are deprogrammed your attachment to your mother and reprogrammed to have an attachment to your father, or the other way around if the mother is the abuser. But so it's really about these camps that are really about trying to reestablish a relationship with an abusive parent, against all the instincts of these children. I mean, a lot of these children are quite young, and so they operate on instinct. And if they're scared of a parent, well, they're scared of a parent, and they can't be put into situations where they're being forced and they're being told that their feelings are wrong. The things that they know to be true about what they've experienced in their lives, you're told that you're actually wrong. And if you're a 5 or 6 year old, how are you supposed to process this?
Right. Yep.
When you've got supposedly an authority figure telling you that everything you think to be true is wrong. So it's these are really, really harsh measures.
Yeah, it's institutional gaslighting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Everything that you think and you believe, and that your reality is wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Not to be trusted. So, okay. So the second point in Kayden's law is to limit the use of these reunification camps.
Yeah.
And the third
point is trying to create more evidence-based training for judges and court appointed personnel, which is a smart move, as we talked about before, that a lot of these judges simply don't have backgrounds in domestic violence. They're adjudicating on things that they have no understanding of. And it's obviously leading to, just backwards outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then the last point
is requiring that family courts making parenting time decisions consider past evidence of abuse. So, I mean, it's extraordinary that this even has to be.
We have to legislate this, right?
Yeah. I mean, because a lot of the time, a lot of these people, women might have restraining orders against their former partners. And family courts are saying, well, that's not really admissible evidence. And you're like, well, what are you talking about? I mean, this is...
Yeah. There, these two cases that I always come back to are the Depp Heard and Gabby Petito, right? And the traffic stop in Moab and that footage, right? Where, again, this is, the providing training for people to recognize the signs of domestic violence, because all of the domestic violence advocates, people who knew what was, what to look for in that traffic cam footage, or the body cam footage, it was clear to us, right, that Brian Laundrie was just completely calm. And when they said to him, like, oh, you're the victim of domestic violence, he laughed. Like, who fucking laughs when they're told that they're a victim, right? And she's out of control. She's hyperventilating, right? And again, if there had been any training, right? And cops can't be trained in everything, which is why, we need different agencies to be responding to these things, right? But again, this is why we need this training, because when you've got people like that right in front of a judge, and there's clear evidence that anyone with training would recognize, people's lives would be saved.
I think what we've got is a lag. There's a legal lag in the values and the knowledge that we've obtained now as societies, and what the legal systems actually know. Legal systems are trying to catch up to a lot of these developments in social psychology and sociology and whatnot. But unfortunately, it is their job to keep themselves abreast of these developments and this new knowledge, and they're just not doing it.
That's right. Well, yeah, and it's like, well, there's a lag, but like there shouldn't, like, right? There shouldn't be. This is not. It's not rocket science, actually. No. And I think that's when going back to parental alienation, one of the things is that there's a lot of incentives in the system to try and convince courts that something more complex is going on. So if you just say, oh, well, there's evidence of child abuse, there's evidence of domestic abuse, and anyone, standing at the bus stop can see it with their own two eyes. Well, that's actually too simple. That this is these professionals. That's actually too simple. What's actually happening is something more complex is happening, and that gives them power within the system, because they get to be the person who
who owns the complexity, and they're the ones who can explain to judges that, oh, well, this is more complex than just, the obvious cases of abuse. So this is a kind of a phrase I've been using with regard to parental alienation, is that it's a concept that has no professional credibility, but it has great professional incentives, and that's the problem.
That is the problem, and the incentives being all of these financial incentives. How does the court benefit from these financial incentives, right? Because you've got the reunification camps that cost, by the way, like $20,000 to $40,000. How is the court? How are the judges?
Court benefits from it, but I think there's just this economic infrastructure around the court now that has, I would say, that has captured the court. You just have all things like reunification camps, things like lawyers who now specialize in parental alienation, therapists and PA experts and whatnot. There's this whole web of actors around courts now that have these economic incentives, and courts have become enmeshed in them. Courts have become captured by them. So it's very difficult for courts to kind of find their way out of all these kind of professional and economic incentives that surround them.
Right. The fathers' rights movement, and how, right, they have somehow, despite the evidence that family court is biased against women, they have somehow convinced the world that it's biased against them.
The name Fathers' Rights Movement says it all, really, because what we should be talking about, children have rights, parents have responsibilities, and that is the lens that we have. So what these fathers' rights groups say, well, no, fathers have rights. It's a father's right because they have the household authority. It's not the father's responsibility or the father's privilege to raise a child. It's the father's right to control a child or control their partner. So the name says it all with these groups. I mean, it demonstrates what their worldview is, but unfortunately they've been very good at convincing the world that they're the victims here and that these courts are biased against men.
Unbelievable. So where do we go from here, Grant? Where do you see this going? I mean, we've had these rulings. We've had a few, like I think in Pennsylvania, right? The European court in Italy. There's been some movement making rulings about this internationally, certainly not really in the US.
I mean, there are positive developments. So I think Caden's law is a positive development, but these are steps, unfortunately. Unfortunately, these courts are not going to change their behavior overnight. But I think there is some movement. There's greater public recognition. So in Australia, just recently, there's been new legislation which kind of ends the idea of equal shared parental responsibility, which is this idea that both parents should be responsible for the child, which makes it incredibly difficult to protect a child from an abusive parent.
Sure.
So that's a positive development in Australia. I think it's all going to come in steps, and unfortunately, you can create new laws, but then the way courts interpret laws is another issue. Courts have quite a big way to interpret laws, and the culture of courts is difficult to change as well. So I do think that there's a lot of positive movement, and media outlets are starting to pay a bit more attention to this as well. It's going to be steps, and unfortunately, for a lot of children and for a lot of mothers, the steps aren't going to be quick enough. I feel positive just because over the last few years, I've been in contact with an incredible group of women and mothers who are working to change these systems. And I think that they won't be defeated. Like, they're too strong, they're too incredible, they're too on top of the issues, and they're too have this clear sight about what needs to change. And they have this moral authority to them. And I don't think that these women will be defeated. They will eventually win. It may take time, but I think that they will win.
So who are these? Is this a group that you're involved with? Or is this?
There's a loose network of So there's academics, there's women who've been through family court systems as well, who now have made it their kind of primary task to help other women through.
Yes. Caitlin Jorgensen is one that I love, and Tina Swithin, and
Tina Swithin, yeah. So Tina, and there's another two women, another American woman called Tracy Wallace, and an Australian woman called Renee Lee. They have a little organization called Movement of Mothers, who they kind of they're very active, and they're very strong in terms of tracking down every kind of little piece of evidence and every article and every little movement and collating it and kind of bringing it to public attention. They do an incredible job. I think that there are a lot of women, and this is international as well. So
it needs to be, yeah.
And there are also, I should say, a number of men. There's an academic at the University of Ottawa in Canada, Simone Lapierre, who's doing a lot of work in understanding parental alienation and how it has captured these legal systems. So it's not just women working on this issue. There's a number of men as well who are doing incredible work.
Yeah. And so just in sort of final, my audience, women listening to this are going to be facing this or are facing this, are in the trenches with this. What advice do you have for them? How do women, since we're not at the tipping point yet, I think I agree with you. I think we're approaching some form of tipping point. I think the Catherine Kasanoff case definitely brought a lot more attention, right? We have to be talking about this more and more. But what do you say to women who, like you said, we're not there yet, and a lot more women and children are going to be suffering, but like, oh my God, right? For the women who are in it now, how can they approach the court system armed with enough evidence and information? What do they need to do?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. This is something that I haven't been working on myself, but I know that Tina, that you mentioned before, I mean, I think she does have a bit of a checklist for women to go through and how to approach these situations. I think it's difficult because of the trap that's set up. Part of the problem is that if you're too emotional, the courts will say, oh, well, look, she's crazy and whatnot. But if you're not emotional enough, she'll say, well, she actually doesn't care. So there is this completely double standard. So it's difficult. There are lawyers out there who are doing incredible work, who know how to work against these concepts, especially the concept of parental alienation, who've worked out how to counter the claims as well. But in a lot of cases, you do need a sympathetic judge as well, unfortunately, and it comes down, and a lot of these judges come in with preconceived ideas, and when that happens, there's not a lot you can do.
Right. And I think, one of the most important things that women can do, and it's such a huge ask. I understand it's a huge ask. You are in the midst of trauma. You are working like hell to protect a traumatized child. And so it's a lot to say. And then you also have to educate yourself. And, Caitlin Jorgensen, I love on her Instagram, she has a lot, and in her programs too, she has a lot of information about basically how we have to be when we go to court, and how it is not fair at all, but you have to be unemotional. You have to be clear. You have to state your case in these particular ways to be able to be heard, right? And it's a lot to ask a woman who is emotional, who is terrified, who is fighting with every bone and instinct in her body to want to protect fiercely, mama bear, fiercely fucking protect her children, to do it in a sort of clinical, non-emotional, right? Like, it's a lot to ask. And yet that's kind of what has to be done, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's what has to be done. And, it's deeply unfair that women have to present themselves in these sort of ways. And while these kind of standards are not held to men can walk in and behave however they like, and they'll be treated with respect by the courts and treated with as if their word is kind of gospel.
And if they cry, they just love their children so much.
Absolutely. It's a horrible double standard. So unfortunately, this is the case. But I think there are people out there now who are providing these modes of operation, the way you go in and the way you do this, and these will be helpful to you, and hopefully that you do have judges who are starting to educate themselves now. I don't know what the pickup rate for the states in the United States is from Cadence law. I suspect many states would have preconceived ideas themselves. The legislatures have preconceived ideas, and that they'd rather just do away with the funding. They'd rather not have the funding than implement these initiatives. And that's disappointing. But hopefully, in the states that do start to implement these initiatives, that there's some change.
Oh, let's hope. Well, I mean, I think, thanks to people like you, women listening to this podcast, and really us educating more and more people about this, I think, we're making noise. We're finally being heard.
Making progress. I'm very confident that progress is being made.
Grant, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. I appreciate it so much. It's you are a wealth of information. Your article on your Substack, which everyone needs to read, I will link to it in the show notes. But where can people find you if they want to follow your work? And
so you can find me on Substack, which is internationalblue.substack.com, where I write a weekly newsletter, which provides just kind of a summary of things that I'm doing during the week, and a whole series of articles that I've read during the week, and also provide a little playlist of a theme during the week.
Oh, fun.
And then there are occasional essays that appear on the Substack as well. Beyond that, you can find me at the Diplomat, where I write on Australia and the Pacific Islands. And you can occasionally find me. You can find me at Twitter at Grant Wyeth, just all one word. I don't use Twitter very much at the moment.
Are you on Threads yet, Grant?
I've gone to Threads, but I haven't been posting that much. But unfortunately, Twitter has become a hell site. I mean, it probably was
shit show.
It was a hell site previously. Now it's more of a shit show, I think. Thanks to Elon Musk and his own pathetic little narcissism. So that's where you can find me if you want to reach out. And anyone who wants to reach out and have a chat, feel free to find me.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate your knowledge and research and wisdom on this subject. It's just incredibly important. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me on.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Divorce Survival Guide podcast. If you like what you hear, head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen in and leave me a review. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram at the Divorce Survival Guide. I'll see you next time, and until then, remember, you, my love, deserve to be happy.